Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stan Houle, and we're here to talk about the rental review checklist. It's a review, reviewers of the rent comparability study. We had hoped that, that we would have the PowerPoint of the presentation and the actual checklist up on our website for you guys to draw down today. Unfortunately, there was a technical glitch, but we will have that available to you hopefully tomorrow, and we'll send everyone that's on the attendee list a link so that you can reach out to those for that material shortly. Rents in the Section 8 program are set by the market. In order to be set by the market, we established several years ago a document called the Rent Comparability Study that's used to set rents for those contracts. A couple of years ago, we found that the department hired a contractor to study the preparation and review of those studies, and that contractor came up with several recommendations. We're going to have a second round, actually, coming up shortly, where the contractor is going to be doing some additional work for us on rent comparability studies. And next year, they're going to be reviewing studies that have been done more recently to just see if the improvements that we've made actually result in any improvement. But what we're focused on today is the contractor found that the instructions for preparing the rent comparability studies was pretty good. But the instructions for reviewing them, and especially the use of a standard checklist by everyone for reviewing the documents, was lacking. The contractor developed a checklist that was submitted out to the field earlier this year. You made several comments on it, which we incorporated. We've now revised it, and we're going forward to present it this afternoon. You can use this checklist now for reviewing the Section 8 rent comparability studies, but after September the 1st, we're going to require that all reviews for all rent comp studies that come in after September 1st have to use this checklist that we're going to go through today. The source information, where you find out what this is all about, is in a document called the Section 8 Renewal Policy Guide, specifically Chapter 9. Sections 9-7 through 15 give you some instructions for preparing the document, and sections 17 through 20, which is where we're going to be focusing today, will give you information on the review of those documents. The website location is that real long address down below, and as I said, this is also where the document is going to be and where this PowerPoint will be. We will send those, as I said, out to you hopefully tomorrow. Let me go very briefly and tell you what we're going to tell you. First, we're going to talk about the intended audience. The intended audience for this presentation primarily is for those people who are going to be undertaking the initial and the substantive review of the rent comparability studies. So you folks, please pay extra attention to the session. We're going to be discussing the initial and substantive checklists, which we will get into in a minute. As we go through, we're going to highlight some of the shortcomings that the contractor found where we need to pay a little additional attention. And three, which is something that is most important, we're not going to be discussing any new policies in this presentation. Basically, what this checklist will be doing will be taking the existing guide and putting it into a format so that whoever is reviewing the document according to the guide the way it is right now will have a standard way of looking at those rent comparability studies. Now, what does the checklist look like? Well, first of all, it's in Excel format. The slide that hopefully you can see right now from the screen, the cover sheet looks like this. It says Review Checklist, a very catchy and innovative title that we came up with. There's a cover sheet. There's the initial screening. There's the detailed compliance review portion of the document. There's a rent grid analysis. There's an issues memo that the reviewer will send back. And there's a certification that the person who is doing the reviews will actually send back to the performance-based contract administrator. Now, kind of walk through some of the specific parts of this document. The initial review, the reviewer data. The reviewer data is, at this point, is pretty cut and dried. These are yes/no questions, yes/no answers. The project name is fairly easy to understand. The contract number is fairly easy to understand. The receipt date in the office. This is one of those items that we need to take a little bit more care in looking at, because when the contractor was reviewing these documents, they estimated that somewhere in 30% of the reviewed documents did not have a receipt date stamped on the document. We need those in order to make estimates for future timing. The contract expiration date, and then the PBCA or the TCA's name, whoever's going to be reviewing it. The reviewer data, which is just a little bit lower down on that first page, the initial reviewer name, the substantive reviewer name, if you know it at the time, and you may not. The 9th question is the owner cover letter. Again, here's one of those instances where we found that there was some missing documentation, where somewhere in the neighborhood of 44% of the documents that were reviewed by the contractor did not have an owner cover letter. We really need to have that, and it needs to be checked. There's an appraiser certification that needs to come along, needs to be checked, an appraiser's transmittal, and the documents in order of section 9-14. There's a little note at the bottom of the page in 9-14 that gives all the documents and the order of those documents. The reason why we request and require that the documents be in order is because when you as the reviewer are looking through it, it's much easier if you see 1, 2, and the third one is missing, then you know it's missing, as opposed to it's 20 pages back. Again, almost 40% of the RCSs that were reviewed did not have the documents in the order that's prescribed in the guide. And the reason for that is simply to make it easier for you, the reviewer, to be able to go through the review. If we switch down to the middle of the page on that first initial review screen, again, these are quantitative, not qualitative answers. They're yes, no. But when we get down to number 13, or get down a little bit further, you're going to see on the, let me go back. You're going to see in the middle of that slide right there that there's a little gray area. What that means is that if the initial reviewer marks a no, there's going to be a little note that's going to pop up and says, more work needs to be done. So if the initial reviewer says, I can't find it, then someone, the initial reviewer, is going to have to call the appraiser and say, send it in to us. So, the next questions that the initial reviewer is going to be asking is, are all the items in 9-14 included? Again, a simple yes/no answer. If they're included, we're good. If they're not included, the appraiser needs to submit it. Are all the items in 9-16 included? Again, yes/no. Is the market area map included? Is there a map? Yes/no. And was the comp selection explained? Again, at this point, the initial reviewer is simply looking to see if there's a paragraph or if there's some statements made in that document that says there was something done. The qualitative part that the substantive reviewer is going to be looking at shortly, that's for a later time. The next section is the document review. We're still on initial review, but in this case, we're looking, is there a rent grid included for every primary Section 8 unit type? So if you've got 3 or 4 different types of unit types, there's got to be a rent grid for every single one of those. Is the explanation of how market rents were derived for secondary types there? Again, not quality, but making sure that at least there's some text in the blocks or in the box or in a paragraph in the document. Did the appraiser explain the rent grid adjustments? As an appraiser, everyone goes through and makes slight adjustments or major adjustments, and we have to see, or you have to see, was there an explanation of those adjustments? We'll get into the quality in a little while. Next, was there an explanation of how the markets were derived from the adjusted rents? Again, all of these questions have to have been answered yes, or the initial reviewer needs to go back and take a second look and get the information back. We're still on the first page, but now we're going to the timeline. Timeline compliance check. What we're talking about there is certain rules require that a rent comparability study be timely. And we want to make sure that the material that we get in for review is timely. So we look at the date of the appraiser's transmittal. Did the appraiser complete the certification? Yes, no. Is the date on the certification within 90 days? Did the appraiser update the information? Let me back up. Is the date within 90 days? In this case, we had almost 20% of the rent comparability studies had more than 90 days between the date signed by the rent comparability, signed by the appraiser, and the date the owner submitted to you guys for review. That means that the data is starting to get stale and needs to be refreshed. We move along to, did the appraiser update the information? If the information was getting stale. The date of the rent comparability study, put that in there. The date of RCS collection of the data, and the date of the owner's submission. This is the date that's on the owner's letter. And again, there's a timeline there that if the appraisal that's signed by the appraiser is more than 90 days old by the time the owner's letter is signed, that means that the study is getting stale. The last part of this, again at the bottom of the initial review, calls for the person who's undertaking the initial review to make some decisions. They need to check whether or not the study was complete or incomplete, incomplete or meets minimum requirements. signs it, dates it, and then decides on what further action needs to be taken. This is at the bottom of that first form. Now we switch from the form and from the discussion where we're talking about the initial review to the part of the review where we get into the meat of the matter, the substantive review. The substantive review has 39 questions. Again, in this section, we've included the section of the Section 8 guide that pertains to these particular questions, so that if there's any issues about not understanding what the reviewer needs to look at or how they need to consider what the appraiser has done, the specific section in the guide is listed. We've also done this, hopefully, it's been designed to ease the review of the rent comparability study. The first part of the substantive review is the scope of work. There are 5 questions. The questions and the answers for those questions are found in section 9-9 of the guide. 5 questions. Dates and numbers and types of inspections. Inspections of the comparability of the comps. Information on interviews that the appraiser may have taken with people living in different properties. An explanation of data that was not obtainable. If you couldn't get information on certain properties or you couldn't find something, then that needs to be explained. And help from any assistants that are that are assisting with the work. Let me mention at this point that as you guys probably well know, that going forward in this review, what an appraiser and a reviewer are doing is an art, it's not a science. It is the decision of the reviewer to accept or to request further documentation from the appraiser if there's something that the reviewer says, I don't understand this, or I don't agree with it, or prove it to me. So there's not, as I said, there's not a science to this, it's an art. Below the scope of work is a description of the subject property. What are we doing the appraisal on? This section contains 9 questions, including site characteristics and improvements, unit mix, which is explained in 9-9A1, the condition of the property, the designation for whether or not it's elderly or not elderly, and a description of the utilities that may or may not be included in the rent. Again, in every case, the reviewer is looking to see if the appraiser completed the review according and filled out and put this type of information in the document. Going forward for further description of the subject, we're also looking at a paragraph on the unit design and amenities. Again, this is one of those where there was almost 10% of the documents that were submitted and reviewed 2 years ago did not have any discussion about the unit design and amenities. Need to look for those and make extra sure that that information is included. We need to make sure that there's a paragraph on the project services and amenities. Does it have a swimming pool? Does it have a tennis court? Does it have a bowling alley? Does it have whatever that the folks would be able to use? Does it have at least 5 labeled photographs, exterior and interior? And most important, does it have the contact information of the people that the appraiser talked to come up with his numbers and his information? Now, switching from the actual property itself to the subject market area. Again, we're at the bottom of the page of the substantive review, part 2. There needs to be an identification of the geographic area for the target market, and that's a fairly standard kind of thing, but it has to be in there. And more importantly, is the definition of the geographic area described and, more importantly, justified. So has the appraiser said, this is what my market area is, this is what my neighborhood and market area for this property is. Now we move on to neighborhood. We're in substantive review. We're looking at a description of the neighborhood. And this is where we found in some cases a falling down in what some of the appraisers had done. We look at the demographics, the accessibility, and the property uses in the neighborhood. We look at employment drivers, social outlets, and civil users. Now, just to let you know, again, as people reviewed these documents from a couple of years ago, 15% of the document rent comparability studies that we got in did not have any information on the demographics, accessibility, and property uses, surrounding property uses to the subject. Needs to be in there. In addition, the document needs to have accessibility, and it needs to describe nuisances in the neighborhood. This is one where nuisances, where 60% of the documents that were reviewed did not have a description of any nuisances in the neighborhood, and those kind of things really do need to be included in the study. And if, as a reviewer, you don't see them, then you need to call the appraiser and ask him where that information is. In the middle of the page, there's a narrative describing the selection of comparables. Probably one of the more difficult areas is how the appraiser decided to select the comparables that he or she did select. In this selection of the comparables, is there a detailed explanation of the process to select the comps? Was that and is that a reasonable explanation of how it works? Did the appraiser use appropriate comparables for each unit? When I say appropriate, again, we go back to the whole idea that this is an art, not a science. So appropriate is in the eyes of the beholder, shall we say, but still, between the reviewer has to make a judgment call that the comparables that the appraiser selected are appropriate. If the answer is no, then what's the explanation that the appraiser would have provided, and is there justification for not selecting appropriate comps? If there are less than 5 comparables selected, then is there justification provided? There's an old saying that's part of the business that goes, strive for 5. That's been, I think in some cases, misinterpreted that it has to absolutely be 5. That's not true according to the existing guide. If the appraiser cannot find 5, then he doesn't have to have 5. However, and the big however, is that he's got to justify not having those extra 5. The last on this section is, does the subject have unassisted units in it? And if so, then did you use those unassisted units or not? And if not, then you need to justify why you didn't use the unassisted units in an assisted project. A little further on down on substantive review is the locator map for the subject and the comparables. This is a fairly standard requirement. It's fairly understandable, but we want to make sure that it identifies the subject, all the comps, and also roads, barriers, rivers, railroads, everything else that's on a standard map, so that you can get a visual of the location of that property versus the comparables, and also that property versus other barriers or other entities in the neighborhood. At the bottom of the substantive review, we talk about comparable property profiles. We're looking, and the appraiser must provide names, addresses, and the contact information for the comparables that were selected, photographs of the exterior, because in many cases you do not have the ability to get photographs of the interior of the units. We don't require interior photographs. A uniform format for rent and unit mix table. A description of rent restrictions or subsidies, because if the rents are restricted through some mechanism, then those rents may or may not have an impact on, quote, the market for units in that community. And an explanation of the exclusions for any unit types. For example, if you do have rent-restricted units, then explain why you didn't use those comparables. Going on to the next page, the rent grid analysis. For each rent grid, which is the standard rent grid form, for each one of those, there needs to be a rent grid analysis for each one that's in the document. That's included on the top of the page. Let's see if I can find that. No, I can't find it. But anyway, trust me, there is a requirement for a rent grid analysis for every project, for every rent grid. Now we get into, again, this is the last part of the substantive review, and this is the analysis of the adjustments. It's one of the more important pieces of the review, and it's also a very important part of the appraisal. So the questions are for this: do the subject entries match what's on the rent grid? That's a fairly simple question. Unfortunately, the answer is not always yes. Do the entries for the comps match the comparable property profiles? Simple check back and forth to make sure that the numbers that are in the rent grid and what's in the profile agree. If there's an adjustment for a swimming pool for that particular property, and you go back to the entry for the comp and there's no swimming pool there, then we've got a problem, and that needs to be explained or redone. Are the adjustments uniform? If you're making an adjustment of $5 for some amenity in one property, and you make an adjustment of $10 in another property for the same amenity, then either you have to find out what that was, or you have to have it explained by the appraiser. Like I said, if there's differences, they have to be explained. Now, if the appraiser has adjusted market rent of the primary unit type to arrive at a secondary unit type, is the explanation reasonable? Looking at what the appraiser has submitted, the reviewer has to make a determination as to whether or not it's reasonable. In the middle of the form is another, the next to last section is what's called the concluded rent analysis. A couple of questions here that need to be answered. And those are, is the estimated rent within the adjusted rents? The answer is, hopefully, the answer is yes. And did the appraiser use the appropriate methodology for coming up with those numbers? That is one of the big decisions that the reviewer is going to have to undertake and do a review of. Once they've come to that, they do the final assessment. The final assessment is that large block that's at the bottom of this form on the screen here that says, does the reviewer conclude that the rationale for the comp selection, the adjustments, and the final market rent, are they supported and are they reasonable? It's a long question, but again, it's kind of a yes-no answer. However, in addition to being a yes-no answer, the reviewer's got to provide commentary, provide a statement to follow up the yes or no. And now, the other part that we also do is once the appraiser has gotten to this phase, or certainly before he's gotten to this phase, if the reviewer is having questions, having concerns, having problems, we want them to continue the process that they have done in the past, and that is pick up the phone, call the appraiser and say, this is missing, or I'm not comfortable with what you're saying here. Can you make this adjustment? Or some other internal discussion before it gets to the formal answer that's going to come back to me. Because if everything works out fine, then we'll go to this document called the FollowUp. And the FollowUp is basically an issues memo that the reviewer signs. Hopefully, they're going to sign it and say everything looks good, or if they've had some discussions with the appraiser and they can't come to a mutually agreeable solution, those things will be highlighted in this document, which will then be sent. The reviewer will send a formal document to the PBCA. The PBCA will take it, look at it, do whatever they want to with it, and then they will pass this document along to the owner. And if there's any discrepancies or if there are any problems, then it escalates to a level where the owner and the appraiser has to respond formally. Again, sent to the PBCA. PBCA contacts the appraiser, but we still encourage before that point informal communication between the two. The last thing we're going to talk about is the certification of the substantive reviewer. At this point, the substantive reviewer is finished doing their work. They complete and sign the top portion of the form. They look and read through all of the certifications down there at the bottom, and they sign it. Now, the portion in the gray is completed by the PBCA, and most importantly, the entire package is then included in the project file. We've walked through the document itself. It's not really that long. And hopefully, as we said in the beginning, the document itself will speed the process of doing the reviews, will make it easier for reviewers to look through the rent comparability studies. As I also mentioned earlier, we will have a firm later this year in place to take a look at Chapter 9 and maybe come up with some other recommendations, but we don't know what those are yet. So we wanted to get this document out so you guys could begin working on improving the review process. At this point, what I'd like to do, since we finished the actual presentation, is to open it up for a few minutes for some questions from you guys out there in the field or from here in the audience. Cynthia, do we have any?
Yes. Oh, okay. It appears that more work may have to be done by the reviewer and that the cost of the review may increase.
That the question was that the possibility that there may be more work done, have to be done because of the substantive review. Well, the guide has always said that these actions need to be undertaken. There needs to be an initial and a substantive review of these documents so that we can make sure that the rents that are generated from these rent comparability studies are fair and they really and truly represent the market. So there really should not be any additional work that's going to be undertaken. As I mentioned a minute ago, the format that we have come up with hopefully will actually streamline the process so that the amount of time that it takes a reviewer to undertake the work actually ends up to be less.
Who does the initial and who does the substantial review?
Okay, a question came in about who does what. Well, the guide is a little bit fuzzy, but basically it says that the initial review should be supervised by a state, let me get the language correct, by a state certified general appraiser, but ideally the person who is reviewing for these substantive reviews should be state licensed. It doesn't say that it absolutely has to be. However, we strongly prefer that the substantive part of the review be undertaken by, at minimum, a state-certified general appraiser. For the initial review, again, since the initial review is primarily yes/no answers, then if the PBCA prefers, this is not a requirement of us, but if the PBCA prefers, then they can undertake the initial review of the document. We do have time for additional questions. If you have any, we'll give it a couple more minutes. Well, having no other questions having come through in email, and no other questions from the large turnout this afternoon, I certainly appreciate everyone being on and being a part of this effort to streamline the process. And as I said, we will, to everyone who was on the sign-up list from the internet.
I have a question.
We do have one more question. All right.
Does that mean that a HUD appraiser must review each RCS?
Not a HUD appraiser. I think the question was, does that mean that a HUD appraiser has to review each rent comparability study? And the answer to that is no, that if the performance-based contract administrator hires a licensed appraiser to review the document, then HUD itself does not have to go behind the PBCA appraiser and do a second review.
Please advise, RCS appraiser make several different rents for same type of unit due to floor location, unit size, etc. Should we change unit types in tracks?
I'm going to have to take that question under advisement. I'm not sure what the answer is right now, but we will certainly get the answer back to you. Okay, if there's no other questions, as I said, we certainly appreciate your time, and we will get the material out to you, the material out to you, a link out to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.